Officer Daniel Carter's world turned upside down when he spotted an innocent little girl clutching a piece of cardboard. What was scrawled on that makeshift sign would haunt him for years to come. As he approached, the girl's fearful eyes met his, and she spoke words that shook him to his core. In that moment, Carter knew he was stepping into something far deeper and more heartbreaking than he could have ever imagined. Who was this child? And why did her mysterious message lead to a discovery that would test the limits of law and compassion? Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching or listening from today, and if you enjoy this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. The oppressive heat of the midsummer afternoon bore down on the bustling streets of Millbrook City. Officer Daniel Carter, a weathered cop in his early 40s, guided his patrol car through the familiar urban landscape. The cacophony of city life, honking horns, bustling pedestrians, and the distant wail of sirens created a symphony of organized chaos that Carter had long since learned to tune out. As he navigated the congested streets, Carter's blue eyes scanned his surroundings with a detached efficiency. Years on the force had honed his ability to spot trouble, but they had also dulled his emotional response to the daily grind of city life. The wrinkles around his eyes and the premature grey at his temples told the story of a man who had seen too much, weathered too many storms. Carter's mind wandered, as it often did during these monotonous patrols, to the empty house that awaited him at the end of his shift. The divorce papers, finalized just 6 months ago, still sat in a drawer in his kitchen, a tangible reminder of another failure in his life. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the task at hand. As he approached a rundown convenience store on the corner of 5th and Main, something caught his eye. A small figure dressed in a vibrant pink dress that stood out against the drab surroundings walked purposefully towards the store's entrance. Carter slowed the patrol car, his instincts prickling. The child, a young black girl no more than 8 years old, entered the store alone. Carter's brow furrowed. In this neighborhood at this time of day, an unaccompanied child was a red flag he couldn't ignore. He pulled the car to the curb, keeping his eyes fixed on the store's entrance. Minutes ticked by, each one ratcheting up Carter's unease. Finally, the girl emerged, clutching a paper-wrapped sandwich in one hand and what appeared to be a bottle of alcohol in the other. Carter's heart sank. If his suspicions were correct, he was witnessing a serious violation of the law. Without hesitation, Carter exited his vehicle, his movements deliberate and practiced. As he approached the girl, he noticed something that made his stomach churn. She was barefoot. The realization hit him like a physical blow, adding another layer of concern to an already troubling situation. "Hey there," Carter called out, trying to keep his voice gentle despite the urgency he felt. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" The girl's head snapped up, her eyes widening with fear as they locked onto Carter's uniform. In a flash, she turned and bolted, her small feet slapping against the hot pavement as she ran towards a narrow alley behind the store. Carter cursed under his breath, breaking into a run. "Wait," he called out, but the girl had already disappeared into the shadows of the alley. By the time he reached the entrance, she was gone, vanished as if she had never existed. Panting slightly, Carter stood at the mouth of the alley, his mind racing. The girl's sudden disappearance was perplexing. He scanned the narrow passage, noting the shadowy corners, stacked boxes, and overflowing dumpsters. She could have ducked behind any of these, or slipped through a gap he couldn't see from his vantage point. In the few seconds it had taken him to reach the alley, she had managed to vanish from sight, leaving Carter bewildered and increasingly concerned. As Carter caught his breath, a nagging sense of unease settled over him. Something wasn't right here, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. With one last glance down the empty alley, he turned and headed back towards the convenience store, his jaw set with determination. The bell above the door jangled discordantly as Carter pushed his way into the convenience store. The cool air inside was a stark contrast to the sweltering heat outside, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside the officer's mind. His eyes quickly scanned the interior, taking in the cluttered shelves and grimy floors before settling on the man behind the counter. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a paunch that spoke of too many years behind the counter, was hunched over a stack of receipts. He looked up as Carter approached, his expression morphing from boredom to wariness at the sight of the officer's uniform. "Can I help you, officer?" the shopkeeper asked, his voice carefully neutral. Carter planted his hands on the counter, leaning in slightly. "Yes, you can," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "I'd like to know why you sold alcohol to a minor just now." The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy and charged. The shopkeeper's eyes widened, then narrowed as he processed Carter's words. He raised his hands, palms out, in a placating gesture. "Whoa, hold on there," he said, his voice steady despite the seriousness of the allegation. "I didn't sell any alcohol to a minor. I don't know what you think you saw, but you're mistaken." Carter's jaw clenched. He had been so sure, so certain of what he'd witnessed. "A young girl, about 8 years old, in a pink dress," he pressed. "She just left your store with a sandwich and what looked like a bottle of alcohol. Are you telling me that didn't happen?" The shopkeeper's expression softened slightly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Ah, I know who you're talking about," he said. "But officer, you've got it wrong. That little girl, she bought a sandwich and a bottle of water. Nothing else. Certainly no alcohol." Carter felt the first seeds of doubt begin to take root. He had been so focused on the girl, so sure of what he'd seen. But now, faced with the shopkeeper's calm denial, he found himself questioning his own perception. "Water," he repeated, his tone less certain now. "You're sure about that?" The shopkeeper nodded emphatically. "Absolutely. Look, I know the laws. I've been running this store for 20 years. I would never sell alcohol to a kid, never." Carter studied the man's face, searching for any sign of deception, but all he saw was sincerity and a hint of indignation at being accused of such a serious infraction. I see," Carter said, straightening up. The certainty that had fueled his confrontation was quickly evaporating, leaving him feeling off balance and slightly foolish. "I apologize for the accusation. It seems I may have jumped to conclusions." The shopkeeper's posture relaxed, the tension draining from his shoulders. "No harm done, officer," he said, his tone conciliatory. "We all make mistakes. I'm just glad we could clear this up." Carter nodded, but as he turned to leave the store, he couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease that had settled over him. He had been so sure of what he'd seen, but now doubt clouded his memory. The image of the little girl, barefoot, clutching that bottle, remained vivid in his mind. As he pushed open the door and stepped back into the sweltering heat, Carter's mind raced. If it wasn't alcohol, why had the girl run? And how had she disappeared so quickly in that alley? The questions swirled in his mind, refusing to settle. He climbed back into his patrol car, but instead of pulling away, he sat there, staring at the store's entrance. Something about this situation didn't sit right with him. The girl's bare feet, her sudden flight, her impossible disappearance, it all added up to a mystery that Carter couldn't let go of. With a heavy sigh, he started the engine. As he pulled away from the curb, his eyes scanned the streets, searching for a flash of pink, a glimpse of the girl who had vanished into thin air. But the crowded sidewalks yielded no clues, and Carter was left with nothing but his troubled thoughts and a growing sense that he had stumbled upon something far more complex than a simple case of underage alcohol purchase. As Officer Carter continued his patrol, the bustling city around him faded into a blur of meaningless noise and motion. His mind, usually sharp and focused during his shifts, was consumed by thoughts of the little girl in the pink dress. The image of her bare feet slapping against the hot pavement as she ran from him played on repeat in his head, a haunting reminder of his failure to help her. Carter's hands tightened on the steering wheel as guilt gnawed at him. He should have been faster, should have anticipated her flight. Maybe if he had approached her differently, spoken more gently, she wouldn't have run. And now, because of his misstep, a vulnerable child was still out there, alone and potentially in danger. The weight of past failures pressed down on him, memories rising unbidden to the surface of his consciousness. He thought of the domestic violence case from last year, where his hesitation to intervene had led to a woman being hospitalized. Then there was the drug bust that went wrong, because he had been too confident, too sure of his intel. The faces of those he had failed to protect haunted him, a grim gallery of his shortcomings as an officer and as a man. Traffic crawled to a standstill, and Carter found himself staring blankly at the red taillights in front of him. The girl's frightened eyes flashed in his mind, and he felt a surge of determination. He couldn't let this be another failure. He had to find her, had to make sure she was safe. But doubt crept in, insidious and persistent. What if he was overreacting? The shopkeeper had seemed sincere in his denial of any wrongdoing. Maybe Carter's mind was playing tricks on him, seeing dangers where none existed. It wouldn't be the first time his instincts had led him astray. The blare of a car horn jolted Carter back to the present. The traffic had started moving again, and he mechanically guided his patrol car forward. But his mind remained fixated on the girl, torn between the need to act and the fear of making another mistake. As he drove, the familiar landmarks of his beat took on a different significance. Every alley became a potential hiding place, every group of people a possible clue to the girl's whereabouts. Carter found himself scanning faces more intently, hoping for a glimpse of pink fabric or the flash of recognition in a child's eyes. The afternoon wore on, the summer heat intensifying as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Carter's uniform clung to him, damp with sweat, but he barely noticed the discomfort. His entire being was focused on the missing girl, his duty as an officer warring with his growing personal investment in her fate. He thought about radioing in, about putting out an alert for other officers to keep an eye out for the girl. But what would he say? That he was chasing a hunch, pursuing a child who might not even be in any danger. He could almost hear the skepticism in his colleagues' voices, could imagine the sidelong glances and whispered comments about Carter losing his edge. No, this was something he had to handle on his own, at least for now. He owed it to the girl to find her, to make sure she was safe. And perhaps in doing so, he could begin to make amends for his past failures. With renewed focus, Carter turned his patrol car down a side street, his eyes sharp and searching. Somewhere in this labyrinth of concrete and steel, a little girl in a pink dress was waiting to be found, and Officer Daniel Carter was not going to let her down. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the city streets, as Officer Carter found himself in a bustling area of outdoor cafes and restaurants. He had abandoned his patrol car, opting instead to cover more ground on foot. The change in perspective was refreshing, allowing him to blend in with the crowds and observe more closely. The air was thick with the aroma of grilled meats and spices, mingling with the persistent undercurrent of vehicle exhaust and sun-baked asphalt. Around him, the city pulsed with life. Tourists with maps and cameras jostled for space on the sidewalks, alongside hurried locals and street performers vying for attention. Carter moved through the throng with practiced ease, his eyes constantly scanning, searching for that telltale flash of pink. He had almost given up hope when suddenly, like a mirage shimmering into existence, he saw her. The little girl in the pink dress was weaving her way through the maze of outdoor tables, her small form a stark contrast to the adults around her. Carter's heart leapt into his throat, a mixture of relief and renewed concern flooding through him. He hung back, not wanting to startle her and risk losing her again. From his vantage point, Carter observed the girl's behavior with growing confusion. She moved from table to table, engaging briefly with the diners. Some recoiled from her approach, while others leaned in, their faces a mix of shock and pity. Carter strained to hear what was being said, but the cacophony of the busy street drowned out their words. The girl's demeanor shifted with each interaction. At times she seemed almost cheerful, her small face animated as she spoke. But as she moved away from the tables, her shoulders would slump and her steps would slow. It was a cycle of hope and disappointment that made Carter's chest tighten with empathy. As he watched, a couple at one of the tables beckoned the girl over. The woman reached into her purse, extracting something that she pressed into the child's hand. For a moment, the girl's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire being. But as quickly as it had appeared, the joy faded, replaced by a look of resigned determination as she moved on to the next table. Carter's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. Was she begging, running some kind of scam, or was there something more complex at play here? The questions multiplied, each one adding to the weight of responsibility he felt pressing down on him. Suddenly the girl's path changed. She darted away from the tables, moving with purpose towards a large trash bin nestled between two restaurants. Carter tensed, ready to move, but held himself back. He watched as she reached behind the bin, struggling for a moment before extracting what appeared to be a piece of cardboard. The sight of the girl clutching the cardboard to her chest, her small frame dwarfed by the bustling city around her, stirred something deep within Carter. In that moment, she wasn't just another case, another problem to be solved. She was a child, vulnerable and alone, in a world that seemed all too willing to overlook her existence. With a deep breath, Carter made his decision. He couldn't stand by and watch any longer. Whatever was going on with this girl, he was determined to get to the bottom of it. Slowly, carefully, he began to make his way through the crowd, his eyes never leaving the small figure in the pink dress. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he closed the distance between himself and the little girl. She was still clutching the cardboard sign, her small fingers white-knuckled around its edges. As he drew near, he could finally make out the words scrawled across its surface in uneven, childish handwriting, "Pay what you think I'm worth." The message hit Carter like a physical blow, a stark reminder of the harsh realities that existed in the shadows of their bustling city. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. "Hello there," he said softly, crouching down to be at eye level with the girl. "I'm Officer Carter. What's your name?" The girl's eyes widened with recognition and fear. She took a step back, her body tensing as if ready to bolt at any moment. Carter held up his hands in a placating gesture, careful to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm not here to hurt you or get you in trouble. I just want to make sure you're safe." The girl hesitated, her eyes darting between Carter's face and the busy street behind him, as if calculating her chances of escape. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Nora. My name is Nora." Carter smiled, relieved to have made this small breakthrough. "It's nice to meet you, Nora. Can you tell me why you're out here all alone?" Nora's lower lip trembled, and she clutched her cardboard sign tighter to her chest. I'm not supposed to talk to strangers," she said, her voice quavering. "That's very smart of you, Nora," Carter praised, trying to build trust. "But I'm a police officer, see?" He tapped his badge gently. "It's my job to help people, especially kids like you who might be in trouble." Nora's eyes lingered on the badge, a flicker of hope crossing her face before being quickly replaced by wariness. "I'm not in trouble," she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. Carter nodded, keeping his tone gentle. "Okay, but can you tell me about those bracelets you're wearing? They're very pretty." Nora looked down at her wrist, where several small pink handmade bracelets encircled her thin arm. Her free hand moved to touch them, as if drawing comfort from their presence. I made them," she said softly. "To sell." "You made these yourself?" Carter asked, impressed. "That's really talented, Nora. But why are you trying to sell them on the street? Where are your parents?" At the mention of parents, Nora's face crumpled. Tears welled up in her eyes, and her small body began to shake with suppressed sobs. I can't," she stuttered, clearly overwhelmed. Carter's heart ached at the sight of her distress. He longed to reach out and comfort her, but he knew he needed to maintain a professional distance. "It's okay, Nora," he soothed. "You don't have to tell me everything right now, but I need to know if you're safe. Is there someone taking care of you?" Nora nodded hesitantly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "My brother," she whispered. "But he made me do all this." Alarm bells rang in Carter's mind at her words. "What do you mean he made you do this?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice calm. Nora's eyes widened, realizing she might have said too much. "I don't want to get into trouble," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, I should go." Carter knew he was at a crucial juncture. Pushed too hard and Nora might flee again, but if he let her go now, he might never get another chance to help her. "Nora, listen to me," he said, his voice firm but kind. "You're not in trouble, I promise, but I'm worried about you. No one should make you beg on the streets or sell things you've made. That's not right." Nora's lower lip quivered, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "But we need money," she whispered, "for food and stuff." Carter felt a lump forming in his throat. The reality of Nora's situation was becoming clearer, and it was heartbreaking. "I understand, Nora, but there are better ways to get help, ways that don't put you in danger." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "Can you tell me where you live, where your brother is?" Nora hesitated, conflict clear on her young face. She glanced around, as if expecting her brother to materialize from the crowd at any moment. Finally, she pointed a small, trembling finger towards a nearby underpass. Carter followed her gesture, his stomach sinking as he realized the implications. An underpass was no place for a child to be living. He turned back to Nora, keeping his expression neutral to hide his growing concern. "Nora, would you be willing to show me where exactly? I'd like to talk to your brother if that's okay," he said gently. Nora's eyes widened with fear. "You won't take him away, will you?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. Carter shook his head. "No, Nora, I just want to talk to him, to see if there's a way I can help both of you. Is that all right?" After a long moment, Nora nodded hesitantly. She reached out and took Carter's hand, her small fingers cold despite the warm evening air. As they began to walk towards the underpass, Carter felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. He didn't know what he would find, but he was determined to do whatever it took to help this brave, vulnerable little girl. Carter kept a protective hand on Nora's shoulder, acutely aware of how small and fragile she felt beneath his touch. The bustling city around them seemed to fade away, the noise and activity receding as they approached the shadowy area beneath the overpass. As they drew closer, Carter's trained eye took in every detail. The underpass was a concrete jungle of pillars and shadows, littered with debris and the makeshift shelters of those who had nowhere else to go. The acrid smell of urine and garbage hung in the air, mixing with the dust and exhaust fumes from the traffic above. Nora's pace slowed as they entered this twilight world. Her grip on Carter's hand tightened, and he could feel a slight tremor running through her small frame. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, trying to convey a sense of safety and protection. "It's okay, Nora," he said softly. "Remember, I'm here to help. Can you show me where your brother is?" Nora nodded silently, her eyes darting nervously around the underpass. She led Carter deeper into the shadows, weaving between concrete pillars and piles of discarded cardboard. As they rounded a particularly large pillar, Carter saw it. A blue tent, weathered and patched, tucked away in a corner where two support structures met. "That's it," Nora whispered, pointing at the tent. "That's where we live." Carter's heart sank at her words. The tent was barely big enough for one person, let alone two. How long had these children been living like this, hidden away from the world? As they approached the tent, Carter could make out the shape of someone inside, curled up in sleep. He turned to Nora, keeping his voice low and gentle. "Nora, I need you to wait here for a moment while I talk to your brother, okay? Can you do that for me?" Nora nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. Carter gave her hand one last reassuring squeeze before releasing it and moving towards the tent. "Hello?" he called out softly, not wanting to startle the occupant. "My name is Officer Carter. I'm here with Nora. We need to talk." There was a sudden rustling from inside the tent, followed by a string of muffled curses. The zipper of the tent flew open, and a young man emerged, blinking in the dim light. He was tall and thin, with the same dark skin and eyes as Nora. Despite his apparent youth, Carter guessed he couldn't be more than early 20s. There was a hardness to his features that spoke of a life lived on the edges of society. The young man's eyes widened as they took in Carter's uniform, then narrowed as they darted to Nora standing a few feet away. In an instant, he was on his feet, positioning himself protectively between the officer and his sister. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice rough with sleep and hostility. "What do you want with my sister?" Carter held up his hands, palms out, in a gesture of peace. "As I said, I'm Officer Carter. I found Nora on the street trying to sell bracelets. I'm here to help, not to cause trouble." The young man's posture remained tense, his eyes flicking between Carter and Nora. "We don't need your help," he spat. "We're doing just fine on our own." Carter kept his voice calm and level. "I can see that you're doing your best to take care of your sister, but living under an overpass is no life for a child, or for you for that matter. What's your name?" The young man hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Finally he spoke, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Mikel, my name is Mikel." "Okay, Mikel," Carter said, nodding. "Can we talk? I think we need to discuss your situation and see if there's a way I can help." Mikel's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. He looked over at Nora, who was watching the exchange with wide, frightened eyes. Something in her expression seemed to soften him slightly. "Fine," he said grudgingly, "but not here. There's a bench over there, away from everyone else." Carter nodded his agreement, and the three of them made their way to a nearby bench, set slightly apart from the main area of the underpass. As they walked, Carter couldn't help but notice how Mikel kept Nora close, his hand on her shoulder in a mirror of Carter's earlier gesture. The bench creaked under their combined weight as Carter, Mikel, and Nora sat down. The sounds of the city, the rush of traffic overhead, the distant wail of sirens seemed muffled here in this concrete cavern, creating an odd sense of isolation. Mikel sat rigidly, his body angled protectively towards Nora, who huddled close to her brother's side. The contrast between the siblings was stark, Nora's pink dress a splash of innocence against Mikel's worn, grimy clothes. Carter leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Mikel," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to understand that I'm not here to separate you and Nora. I just want to help." Mikel's eyes, hard and wary, met Carter's. "Help?" he scoffed. "Where was your help when our mother died? Where was it when we had nowhere to go?" His voice was bitter, years of pain and resentment evident in every word. Carter felt the weight of those accusations, even though he knew he wasn't personally responsible. "I'm sorry for what you've been through," he said sincerely. "But I'm here now and I want to understand your situation. Can you tell me how you ended up here?" Mikel was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he seemed to wrestle with whether to trust this stranger in a uniform. Finally he spoke, his voice low and strained. "We came here from Senegal 2 years ago," he began. "Our mother, she was sick. She thought the doctors here could help her." He paused, swallowing hard. "They couldn't. She died 6 months after we arrived." Carter nodded sympathetically, encouraging Mikel to continue. "We had no other family here," Mikel went on. "Our father, he left years ago. We never knew him. After Mom died, we had nothing. No money, no home. The social workers wanted to put us in the system, separate us." His arm tightened around Nora. "I couldn't let that happen. I promised Mom I'd take care of Nora." "So you ran," Carter said softly, understanding dawning. Mikel nodded. "We've been on our own ever since. I've tried to find work, but—" He trailed off, gesturing helplessly at their surroundings. Carter's mind raced, piecing together the harsh reality of their situation. 2 young immigrants alone in a foreign country, slipping through the cracks of a system meant to protect them. "The bracelets," Carter said, glancing at Nora's wrist. "That was your idea." A flicker of pride crossed Mikel's face. "Nora's good with her hands. I thought if we could sell them, make some money." He shook his head. "It's not enough. It's never enough." Carter leaned back, processing everything he'd heard. The situation was more complex than he'd initially thought, layered with issues of immigration, poverty, and a system that had failed these two young people. "Mikel," he said carefully, "I understand why you ran, but living like this, sending Nora out to beg, it's not safe, it's not sustainable." Mikel's face hardened. "You think I don't know that?" he snapped. "You think I want this for her? For us? But what choice do we have?" Carter held Mikel's gaze steadily. "There are options," he said. "Resources, people who can help. But you have to be willing to trust the system again." Mikel laughed bitterly. "The system that wanted to tear us apart, no thanks." "I know it's hard to trust," Carter acknowledged, "but not everyone in the system is the same. There are good people who want to help." Nora, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Like you?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Carter felt a lump form in his throat. "Yes, Nora," he said softly. "Like me." Mikel looked down at his sister, then back at Carter. For the first time, the hard shell of mistrust seemed to crack, revealing the scared young man beneath. "What?" Mikel hesitated, then continued. "What exactly are you proposing, officer?" Carter took a deep breath. He knew what he was about to suggest was unorthodox, possibly even against regulations. But looking at these two young people, Mikel trying so hard to be strong, and Nora resilient despite everything she'd been through, he knew he couldn't walk away. "I have an idea," he said slowly. "It's not a permanent solution, but it could give us time to figure things out, to find a way to keep you together and get you the help you need." Mikel leaned forward slightly, a glimmer of cautious hope in his eyes. "We're listening," he said. As Carter finished outlining his proposal, a heavy silence fell over the trio. The distant rumble of traffic above seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. Mikel sat motionless, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, hope warring with suspicion, desperation with pride. "Let me get this straight," Mikel said slowly, his voice low and controlled. "You want us to come stay with you? In your home?" Carter nodded, acutely aware of how unorthodox his suggestion was. "Yes, but let me explain why I'm proposing this," he said, leaning forward. "I know it's not the ideal legal solution, but it could work as a temporary measure." Mikel's eyes narrowed. "How? We're still undocumented. How does staying with you change anything?" Carter took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "Legally, you're Nora's guardian, Mikel. That's not in question. The issue is your living situation. If you had a stable address, a roof over your head, it would make your role as Nora's guardian more acceptable from a legal standpoint." He paused, letting the information sink in. "It's not perfect, and it doesn't solve everything, but it gives us time. Time to figure out a more permanent solution without the immediate risk of you two being separated by the system." Mikel's brow furrowed as he processed Carter's words. "But won't you get in trouble for harboring us?" Carter nodded gravely. "There's a risk, yes, but if anyone asks, your distant relatives staying with me temporarily while we sort out some family issues. It's not ideal, but it's more believable than the truth." He leaned back, his face serious. "Look, I know this isn't by the book, but I've seen too many cases where following procedure tears families apart. You're doing your best to take care of Nora, and I believe you deserve a chance to do that in a safe environment while we work on legalizing your status." Mikel studied Carter's face, confusion and suspicion warring in his eyes. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you risk so much for us?" Carter took a deep breath, his eyes softening with understanding. "Because I know at least a little bit how you feel," he said softly. "My parents brought me to this country when I was young, looking for better opportunities. We came legally, but I remember how hard it was, the uncertainty, the fear of the unknown, trying to build a new life in a strange place." He paused, his gaze drifting to Nora for a moment before returning to Mikel. "What you've been through, it's so much worse than anything I experienced. But I understand the drive to find a better life, to protect your family, and I can't stand by and watch you struggle when I have the power to help." Mikel's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise and then understanding crossing his face. You're an immigrant too?" he asked, a hint of hope in his voice. Carter nodded. "I am, and while our experiences are very different, I want you to know that I see you, Mikel. I see how hard you're fighting for Nora, for a chance at a better life. You deserve that chance, both of you." Nora, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Does this mean we'll have a real home, with beds and everything?" The innocence of her question brought a lump to Carter's throat. He nodded, smiling gently at her. "Yes, Nora. A real home, at least for now." Mikel looked at his sister, then back at Carter. The suspicion in his eyes was gradually being replaced by cautious hope. "And you really think this could work? That it could help us stay together?" Carter met Mikel's gaze steadily. "I believe it's our best shot right now. It's not a permanent fix, but it gives us a foundation to build on. We can look into legal options, maybe find an immigration lawyer who can help. But the most important thing is that it keeps you two together and off the streets." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I know I'm asking you to trust me, and that's not easy given what you've been through. But I promise you, Mikel, my only goal here is to help you and Nora find a stable, legal way to stay together." Mikel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying Carter's face intently. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, we'll try it your way, but I'm warning you, if you try to separate us—" "I won't," Carter assured him firmly. "You have my word on that. We're in this together now." As the weight of the decision settled over them, Carter felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew he was taking a huge risk, both professionally and personally. But looking at Mikel and Nora, he knew it was a risk worth taking. "All right," Carter said, standing up. "Let's get you two out of here. Do you have any belongings you need to gather?" Mikel nodded, gesturing towards the blue tent. "Just a few things, it won't take long." As Mikel went to collect their meager possessions, Carter knelt down next to Nora. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Nora looked up at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Are we really going to have a real home?" she asked, her voice small and wondering. Carter felt a lump form in his throat. "For now, yes," he said, careful not to make promises he couldn't keep. "And we're going to work very hard to make sure you and Mikel have a permanent home soon." Nora nodded solemnly, then surprised Carter by throwing her arms around his neck in a quick hug. "Thank you, Officer Carter," she whispered. As Carter straightened up, Mikel returned with a small backpack and a plastic bag. The sum total of their worldly possessions, Carter realized with a pang. "Ready?" Carter asked, looking between the two siblings. Mikel took a deep breath, then nodded. "Ready," he said, taking Nora's hand. The drive to Carter's apartment was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts as the city lights blurred past the windows. As they pulled up to a nondescript apartment building, Carter turned to his passengers with what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "We're here," he said softly. The key turned in the lock with a soft click, and Carter pushed open the door to his apartment. He stepped aside, allowing Mikel and Nora to enter first, their eyes wide as they took in their new surroundings. Carter's apartment was modest, a small one-bedroom unit in a nondescript building. The living room, which doubled as a dining area, was sparsely furnished with a worn couch, a coffee table, and a small TV stand. The walls were bare save for a few framed photographs, mostly of landscapes. It wasn't much, but it was clean, and most importantly, safe. "It's not much," Carter said, suddenly self-conscious about the simplicity of his home. "But it's yours for as long as you need it. Nora stepped further into the room, her small hand trailing along the back of the couch. "It's nice," she said softly, a hint of awe in her voice. "It's warm." Mikel remained near the door, his posture tense, eyes darting around the room as if searching for hidden threats. "Where will we sleep?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Carter gestured towards a door on the left. "You and Nora can take the bedroom. I'll sleep out here on the couch." Mikel's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You'd give up your bed for us?" Carter shrugged, trying to downplay the gesture. "It's no big deal. You two need it more than I do." As they settled in, Carter busied himself in the kitchen, pulling together a simple meal from his meager supplies. The aroma of cooking food soon filled the small apartment, creating a sense of homey comfort that had been absent for far too long. After dinner, as Nora dozed on the couch, Carter and Mikel sat at the small kitchen table, mugs of tea warming their hands. The time had come for a serious conversation about the future. "Mikel," Carter began, his voice low and serious, "we need to talk about what happens next. This arrangement, it's temporary. We need to find a way to legitimize your status, to give you and Nora a real chance at a future here." Mikel nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the swirling tea in his mug. "What did you have in mind?" Carter took a deep breath. "I have a friend, a lawyer who specializes in immigration cases. I think we should talk to her, see what options we have. It won't be easy and it might take time, but it's our best shot at keeping you and Nora together legally." Mikel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tightening around the mug. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "And what if it doesn't work? What if they try to send us back?" The fear in Mikel's voice was palpable, and Carter felt his heart clench. He reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on the young man's arm. "Then we'll fight it," Carter said firmly, "every step of the way. I promise you, Mikel, I will do everything in my power to keep you and Nora safe, and together. You have my word on that." Mikel looked up, meeting Carter's gaze. The gratitude in his eyes was mixed with a vulnerability that made him look suddenly young and lost. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why are you doing all this for us?" Carter was silent for a moment, considering his answer. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "Because you and Nora deserve a chance at a real life, not just survival. And because—" He paused, a lump forming in his throat. "Because I've seen too many kids fall through the cracks of a broken system. I can't stand by and let it happen again. Not when I have the power to do something about it." Mikel nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of all he couldn't express. As Mikel guided Nora to the bedroom, Carter began to tidy up the kitchen. His mind raced with plans and contingencies, aware of the enormous task that lay ahead. But as he heard the soft murmur of Mikel's voice reading Nora a bedtime story, he felt a sense of purpose settle over him. Later, as the apartment fell silent and Carter prepared to bed down on the couch, he paused by the bedroom door. Peering in, he saw Mikel and Nora curled up together, their faces peaceful in sleep. For the first time in what must have been months, they were truly safe and warm. As Carter settled onto the couch, pulling a blanket over himself, he allowed a small smile to cross his face. His thoughts drifted to his own family's journey to this country, the challenges they had faced, and the opportunities they had found. He understood, perhaps better than most, the courage it took to leave everything behind in search of a better life. Mikel and Nora's situation was far more precarious than his had been, but their determination and resilience resonated deeply with him. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it also held promise. And that promise, the chance to make a real difference in the lives of these young immigrants, was worth any risk.